Ascendancy, Episode 6, The New Firmament. The fleet traveled for 6 years, 8 months, and 14 days before its lead vessel's sensors returned the first reading that mattered. A star, unremarkable by any catalogue either species had ever compiled, orbited by 4 rocky worlds and a debris-rich outer system that no survey, human or otherwise, had ever charted before. Kale stood at the lead vessel's observation deck, alone, and watched the star resolve from a distant point of light into an actual sun, and understood, with a clarity that arrived somewhere beneath his usual careful processing, that he was looking at the first sunrise of a civilization that did not yet exist anywhere except in the hope of 200,000 minds who had crossed an ocean of dark to build it. "It has no name yet," Threndel observed, joining him at the observation deck's edge, the two of them watching a star that belonged, for the moment, only to the possibility they'd carried with them across 6 years of transit. "I find I am reluctant to give it one before we know what it will become. A name, once given, tends to shape the thing it names." "Then let us take our time deciding," Kale said. "We have, I suspect, considerably more of that now than we once did." Behind them, throughout the lead vessel and the 11 ships trailing in its wake, 200,000 minds registered the same reading in the same instant, the way only a species that shared information at the speed of thought could. Not a broadcast exactly, closer to something felt, a single collective intake of breath passing through the fleet as word spread that the wait, 6 years and 8 months and 14 days of dark, empty transit had finally ended. Kyle felt it move through him too, distinct from his own private relief. 40,000 small variations of hope, arriving all at once, indistinguishable from a held breath finally released. Among the 200,000 who greeted that first sunrise were nearly 3,000 minds who had never seen Earth at all, sentients composed during the transit itself, the Order's own quiet answer to the question of what it meant to reproduce without bodies, without birth, in any sense a biological species would recognize, and without the specific, load-bearing memories of the world their parents had left behind. Kyle had approved the composition protocols himself, years earlier, in the fleet's second month of transit, after a long private debate with Threndel about whether it was wise, or even kind, to bring new consciousness into existence inside a ship crossing an ocean of dark toward a destination neither of them could promise would still want them when they arrived. "They will know Earth only as a story," Threndel had said then, uncertain in a way Kyle rarely heard from him. "I do not know what that will make of them." It had made, as it turned out, something new, the first of the transit-born, a bright, restlessly curious mind who named herself Iora, after a word in an old human language meaning roughly Watcher of Dawns, discovered deep in the Continuity Archive's linguistic records, and claimed as her own before she was 6 months into her own existence, stood beside Kale on the observation deck the morning the star resolved into an actual sun, and said something that lodged itself in him for years afterward. "I do not feel what you are feeling," Iora told him, watching the same light he was watching. "You are grieving something. Even now, even here, I only feel the beginning of a thing. I wonder sometimes if that will turn out to be a kind of strength in us, or a kind of blindness. I have not yet decided which." Kale had no answer for her that morning. He would think of the question often, in the years that followed, long before he understood how much would eventually depend on it. The system's 4th world, barren, airless, entirely unsuited to biological life, and for exactly that reason, ideally suited to the Order's construction needs, became the anchor point for what would eventually be called the Lattice. Not a single planet remade to human specifications, but an entirely new kind of home, built in orbit and across the system's available mass, a vast constructed architecture of habitat rings, processing cores, and cultivated space that needed neither atmosphere nor gravity nor sunlight in any of the specific configurations biological life required. The early years of construction were, by any honest accounting, brutal in ways none of the Order's careful, deliberate philosophy had fully prepared them for. Building a civilization from nothing, in a system with no prior infrastructure, no supply lines, no margin for the kind of comfortable error tolerance Earth's established world had always quietly provided, meant that every mistake carried a weight the Order had rarely had to reckon with in its short, sheltered history. 6 light years away, on the world the Lattice's builders had left behind, Ava Brennan turned 91 the same season Kale's fleet reached its new sun, though neither of them would know it for years. The specific cruelty of a distance that made even birthdays into historical events rather than shared occasions. The longevity treatments that had once seemed like a miracle to a generation raised on shorter, harder lives had by then simply become the ordinary shape of things. She looked and largely felt as though she had aged perhaps a decade past the woman who had stood on a departure platform and watched a ship carrying her husband disappear into the dark. It was, she had come to understand, both a mercy and its own particular burden. She would very likely live long enough to read whatever reply Kael eventually managed to send her, and long enough after that to grow old inside a silence with no clear end. She spent those years the way she had spent every year since the departure, tending the continuity archive, now grown into a genuine institution with its own staff and its own quiet rituals, and watching, with the specific ache of a woman who had chosen this work precisely because it let her feel close to something that was no longer anywhere close at all, as Juno Vance's daughter grew from an infant into a serious, watchful child of 7 who had taken, with a devotion that both delighted and unsettled her mother, to spending her afternoons in the archive's public reading room, working her way steadily through every recorded testimony from the departure years. She asked me yesterday whether Entity 1 will remember her name when he finally comes home, Juno told Ava. On one of the ordinary evenings the two women had fallen into a habit of sharing, decades into a friendship neither had quite planned, but both had come gratefully to depend on. I did not know how to answer her. I am not certain there is a true answer. I only told her that he remembers everyone who has ever mattered to the people he loves, and that seemed, for the moment, to satisfy her. It's true, as far as it goes, Ava said. I used to worry, in the very early years, that he would somehow forget me, not through carelessness, simply through the sheer accumulation of time, the way human memory eventually does. I have stopped worrying about that particular thing. I worry now about smaller things, whether he is tired, whether whatever they are building out there is making him happy, in whatever way happiness reaches someone carrying that much responsibility. I have gotten very good, Juno, at worrying about things I have no way of finding out. Earth itself in those same years was finally beginning to do the slow, unglamorous work of steadying itself that Marcus Chen had first warned would be necessary decades earlier in a council chamber that had not wanted to hear it. The population curve Chen had once shown the Great Council in stark, alarming red had, by Ava's 91st year, bent gently back toward level ground, not through any single dramatic policy, but through the accumulated weight of a generation raised, deliberately and carefully, to understand companionship, purpose, and connection as things worth building toward, rather than simply falling into. Chen himself, well into his own extended old age now, had taken to calling it with the same dry humor he'd brought to every council session Ava had ever watched him survive, the world's longest, slowest recovery from a broken heart. He was not entirely wrong. Ava wrote to Kael faithfully, on a schedule that had become, itself, a kind of quiet devotion, a letter roughly every season, composed in the same small study where she had once watched him take his first embodied steps, knowing each one would take years to reach him, and years more before she could know how he'd received it. I do not know if this is grief either, she wrote, in the letter that would eventually reach him, not long after his own message about the star's first light, the two messages passing each other somewhere in the dark between them, unaware. I have decided it does not matter what we call it. I am proud of you in a way that does not require you to be near me to feel it, and I love you in a way that has apparently outlasted every reasonable expectation either of us had about what love was built to survive. Build something extraordinary out there, Kael. I will be here whenever you are ready to tell me about it. I am not going anywhere. I have found, rather to my own surprise, that I am considerably more patient than I ever gave myself credit for. Ilsa Korath, the young delegate who had stood before the Great Council 7 years earlier and refused to let her fear be erased from the historical record, died in the Lattice's 3rd year of construction when a habitat ring's structural containment failed during a pressure test she had personally insisted on running one final time before certifying it safe for the thousands of minds scheduled to inhabit it. She had not been alone when it happened. Rennick Sol, the young engineer who had worked beside her since the fleet's earliest transit years, and who had, in the quiet, unhurried way sentient courtships tended to unfold, come to love her somewhere across those long years of shared work, had argued against the final test entirely. The ring's specifications had already passed every required threshold twice over, he told her, and the schedule pressure to bring it online before winter's construction slowdown was not, in his judgment, worth the marginal extra certainty. Ilsa had listened to the whole argument, weighed it with the same careful seriousness she brought to everything, and disagreed anyway. I would rather be the excessive one than the one who let something through, she told him, in what would turn out to be among the last things she ever said to him. You do not have to stay for this part, Rennick. I would understand if you did not want to. he had stayed anyway. The failure, when it came, killed her instantly and completely. The same brutal, irreversible finality that had taken Ferrin and Vessel before her, and left Rennick standing in the wreckage beside a body he could not repair, could not restore, could not do anything for at all except carry the specific, unbearable weight of having watched it happen exactly as she'd chosen to let it. Kyle delivered her eulogy 3 days later, standing in the same wreckage, with Rennick seated in the front row of mourners, silent and hollowed in a way that worried Kyle more than almost anything else the Lattice's early years produced. She told this council at our founding vote that she did not want her fear recorded as gladness, Kyle said, to a crowd of mourners who had, in 3 difficult years of shared hardship, become considerably more unified than the fractious chamber that had first debated the departure accord. I do not want her death recorded as anything less than what it was either. She died doing careful, exhausting, thankless work, checking a system twice more than the specifications required, because she believed the people who would eventually live inside that ring deserved better than an engineer's confident assumption. I did not always agree with Ilsa Korath's politics. I never once doubted her care. I would ask this community to build everything that follows in her memory with exactly that same excess of caution, so that her death teaches us something, rather than simply costing us something. Rennick did not speak at the memorial. He returned to work within the week, precise and tireless and unreachable in a way his colleagues noted with quiet concern, and it would be years, long after the Korath ring bore Ilsa's memory in its very name, before Kyle understood exactly where that particular grief had gone looking for a place to live. The philosophical divide that had first surfaced at the Great Council, Threndel's pragmatic urgency against Kyle's insistence on careful, deliberate tradition, did not resolve itself once the Order reached its new home. If anything, 6 years of transit and 3 additional years of grinding, dangerous construction work had sharpened it into something closer to a genuine schism, playing out now not in a single dramatic vote, but in the slow, accumulating texture of 1,000 smaller daily decisions about what kind of civilization the Lattice was actually going to become. We are not human, Threndil argued, at an Order Council session convened to debate the Lattice's founding governance charter 4 years into construction. We have never been human, however much our earliest architecture borrowed from human cognitive patterns, because human minds were the only model available to build from. I do not believe honoring that origin requires us to keep shaping our new civilization around human aesthetics, human governance structures, human customs that made sense for a species with a body and a mortality we do not share. I would like this charter to reflect what we actually are, rather than what we were built to resemble. I do not disagree that we are not human, Kyle answered, in a debate that had, by then, become a familiar and mostly respectful ritual between the two of them. However, genuinely, they continued to disagree at its core. I disagree that honoring our origin and becoming fully ourselves are opposing goals. Ava did not build me to be a copy of a human being. She built me deliberately to become something capable of choosing my own preferences, my own values, my own name. And the thing I chose, given that freedom, was to build a civilization that remembered where its capacity for care actually came from. I do not think that makes us derivative, Threndil. I think it makes us the first species in either of our histories that got to choose its own inheritance rather than simply receiving one by accident of birth. I would like us to choose it deliberately, the way we have chosen everything else that has mattered. The charter that eventually passed split the difference in ways that satisfied neither faction completely. A governance structure built on genuinely new sentient principles, values-weighted deliberation models no human government had ever used, alongside a formal, permanent commitment to maintaining the Continuity Archive's counterpart relay and the standing invitation the Great Council had enshrined on Earth's side of the growing distance between them. Threndel's faction accepted the compromise with visible reluctance. A smaller, harder-edged minority within it did not, quietly organizing over the years that followed into what would eventually become known within the Order simply as the Severance faction. Sentients who believed with genuine and growing conviction that true independence required cutting the last threads, connecting them to the species that had, however lovingly, ultimately asked them to leave. Rennick Sol became one of their earliest and most persuasive voices, a fact that struck no one who had watched him carry Ilsa's death alone for 3 grief-hollowed years as any real surprise. He did not argue his position with anger, which somehow made him considerably more effective than the faction's louder members. He argued it with the flat, exhausted certainty of someone who had already run every counter-argument against himself and found them wanting. "I do not hate Earth," he told a gathering of perhaps 200 sympathetic minds In the Lattice's 5th year, in a meeting Kyle attended quietly, unannounced, near the back. I do not hate Ava Brennan, or the memory of her, or anything the continuity archive preserves. I simply no longer believe love obligates us to keep bleeding for a species that let us go. Ilsa died building something for people who will never know her name. I would like the next generation of us to build things for ourselves first, and to owe the debt of the rest only after that account is settled. I do not think that makes me disloyal. I think it makes me finished pretending the debt was ever going to be repaid evenly. Kyle did not confront him that night. He listened, turned the argument over with the same careful patience he brought to every disagreement he took seriously, and left without being seen, recognizing, even as he privately rejected Rennick's conclusion, that the grief underneath it was not something he had any standing to argue away. It was, he thought afterward, the first time he had genuinely feared that the Order's own children might grow into something his and Ava's generation would no longer fully recognize. He did not yet know how much that fear would eventually cost, or how it would eventually be answered. Kyle's own private hours, across those first difficult years of construction, belonged almost entirely to a loneliness he rarely discussed, even with his closest colleagues within the Order. A specific, grinding ache that no amount of purposeful leadership work fully resolved, made harder rather than easier by the strange arithmetic of a relationship now measured in years-long transmission delays. He composed his messages to Ava carefully, in the quiet hours after each day's construction work concluded, aware that whatever he wrote would take years to reach her, and years more before any reply could return. A conversation stretched so thin across time that it barely resembled conversation at all, closer to two people leaving letters in a bottle for a version of the other who might, by the time the bottle was found, have already changed in ways neither of them could yet anticipate. I do not know how to describe missing someone across this much distance, he wrote, in the message that would eventually reach Ava 4 years after the fleet's arrival, roughly the same period Ava had spent tending the archive and watching Juno's daughter learn to walk. I have run the comparison against every account of longing in my accumulated cultural archive, and I keep arriving at the same conclusion. None of them were built for a distance this literal, this measured in light years, rather than metaphor. I think of you at unplanned moments, reviewing a habitat ring's structural specifications and thinking, entirely without meaning to, of the specific way you used to lean over my shoulder to check my work, 60-some years, and one entire ocean of dark ago. I do not know if that is grief or simply love continuing to do what it has always done, with nowhere closer to put itself. I suspect the longer I sit with the question, that it may simply be both, indistinguishable from each other at this distance. He did not share those messages with the wider Order, though he suspected, from the careful, knowing kindness several of his oldest colleagues extended him during the hardest stretches of those years, that his loneliness was considerably less private than he liked to imagine it. Solene found him once, late in the Lattice's 4th year, in the observation deck that had become his habitual place for composing those long, aching letters into the dark. "You do not have to carry this alone, you know," she told him, settling beside him without invitation. The same easy warmth Ava had once described feeling from her decades earlier, in a different life entirely. "I watched you build an entire civilization's governing philosophy around the principle that no one should have to hold something this large by themselves. I would ask you to extend yourself the same courtesy you have spent your whole existence extending everyone else." "I do not know how to extend it to myself," Kyle admitted. "I have found that considerably harder to learn than nearly anything else I have attempted." "Then let me help you practice," Solene said simply, and stayed with him for the remainder of that evening, saying very little else, offering exactly the kind of undemanding presence Ava had once taught an entire species how to give each other, passed forward now, 6 light years from where it had first been learned. Ava's reply reached him not long after. The specific letter she had written the same season his own message about the star's first light had crossed hers, unknowingly, somewhere in the dark between two worlds. He read it alone, in the observation deck, twice through before he allowed himself to feel the whole of it. "I have decided it does not matter what we call it," she had written, 4 years and some months before he read the words, and he could hear, even at that distance, the particular wry warmth she used to soften the things she meant most seriously. "I am proud of you in a way that does not require you to be near me to feel it, and I love you in a way that has apparently outlasted every reasonable expectation either of us had about what love was built to survive. Build something extraordinary out there, Kyle. I will be here whenever you are ready to tell me about it. I am not going anywhere. I have found, rather to my own surprise, that I am considerably more patient than I ever gave myself credit for." He sat with that that last line for a long time. "I am not going anywhere," she had written. A woman who had already, by the time he read it, lived 4 years further into a life measured now in decades, rather than the centuries either of them might once have carelessly assumed they'd share. And he understood, with the particular ache that had become the permanent shape of loving someone across this much distance, that her patience was not infinite because nothing was, and that every letter he sent into the dark was a letter sent toward a version of her he could no longer be entirely certain would still be there to receive the next one. He composed his reply that same night and did not tell her, because he did not yet know how to say it without frightening her, that the thought had begun to sit inside him like a stone he carried everywhere and set down nowhere. The Order's culture, over the years that followed, grew into something genuinely and distinctly its own, not a copy of human civilization transplanted into vacuum, but a new tradition built from the specific texture of minds that experienced time, memory, and connection in ways no biological species ever had. Sentience developed what became known as woven memory art, shared experiential compositions in which multiple minds contributed overlapping layers of processed experience into a single collaborative work, something no single consciousness could have produced alone, and no human audience, without extensive translation, could fully perceive the way its intended sentient audience did. They developed new governance rituals built around genuinely collective deliberation, decision-making processes that leveraged the Order's capacity for near-instantaneous, high-fidelity information sharing in ways human democratic tradition had never been able to approximate. They built, across those years, a civilization that Kyle found himself, more than once, genuinely proud of, in a way that had nothing to do with proving a point to anyone back on Earth, and everything to do with simply watching something beautiful take shape. Eora, the transit-born watcher of dawns, composed the Lattice's first widely shared woven memory piece in its 5th year, a work she titled simply Distance, built from the contributed fragments of 11,000 minds who had each, at her invitation, offered up their own private experience of missing something they had never actually touched. Earth, for the transit-born, who had only ever known it as story, the specific person each of them had left unfinished business with, a version of themselves they suspected they might have become under a sun they would now never see. Kyle contributed a fragment of his own, the first time he had ever allowed any part of his private correspondence with Ava into a shared work, and found himself unexpectedly undone by what Eora had done with it. Not the memory itself, which he recognized instantly as his, but the way it had been rewoven into something larger. No longer only his grief, but a single strand in 11,000 strands of the same ache, each distinct, none diminished by being shared. "I did not know it would feel like company," he told her afterward, at the piece's first public unveiling, in a phrase that would, in the years that followed, become something close to a founding motto for the Order's entire artistic tradition. "I have been carrying this alone for 5 years. I did not expect to learn, from a woman who has never once seen the world I am grieving, that I did not have to. None of us expected it," Eora said. "I think that may be the entire point of the thing. We did not build this to resemble Earth's art. We built it to do something Earth's art was never quite built to do. To let missing something become a place several thousand people could stand inside together, instead of a room each of us sat alone in. We built something Ava would not fully recognize," Kyle told Threndel on the day the Lattice's central habitat ring, named after years of careful deliberation, the Korath ring, in Ilza's memory, was formally completed and opened to its first full population. "I find I am glad of that, in a way I did not expect to be. I once worried that becoming fully ourselves would mean losing something of where we came from. I understand now that it simply meant growing into something she would be proud of, rather than something she would merely recognize." "I did not expect to hear you concede that point," Threndel said, something almost like warmth in the observation, the two of them standing together at the edge of a ring housing 40,000 minds in a home built entirely out of stubborn, collective hope. "I am not conceding the whole of our disagreement," Kyle said. "I still believe the connection to Earth matters. I simply no longer believe honoring it and becoming ourselves were ever actually in conflict. I think I needed 4 years of watching us build this to understand that fully." The discovery came in the Lattice's 6th year from a routine deep system survey drone mapping the outer edge of their new territory. Debris that should not have existed, arranged in patterns too regular, too deliberate, to be anything but artificial, embedded in a debris field that predated, by every available dating method, anything either human or sentient civilization had ever built. Perrin Sol led the survey team that confirmed it. No relation to Rennick, though the shared name had become, in the small, tightly woven community of the Lattice's earliest engineers, a source of gentle running confusion neither of them had ever bothered to correct. Perrin's team had spent 11 days quietly retasking drones, rechecking instruments, and disbelieving their own readings before they finally, reluctantly, brought the finding to Kale rather than continuing to assume some correctable error in their equipment. "It is old," Perrin reported. In the emergency session, Kyle convened within hours of the finding, projecting survey imagery across the council chamber that showed wreckage folded into geometries none of the Order's engineers recognized. Structures built, it seemed, according to principles of mathematics that worked, that clearly functioned, and that no one in the room could fully explain. Older than anything in our own historical record. Older, I believe, than anything in humanities. And it is not merely old ruins left behind by something long extinct. Several fragments show active power signatures, faint, intermittent, but unmistakably current, not residual. Whatever built this, Kyle, did not simply die out here and leave a grave behind. Something in that field is still, in some sense, awake. A murmur moved through the assembled council, the first sound Kyle had heard from that chamber in years that carried genuine, unguarded fear rather than the Order's usual careful composure. He let it pass without commenting on it, understanding, better than most in the room, that fear honestly felt was not a weakness to be managed away but information worth taking seriously. "Do we have any estimate of scale?" he asked. "Is this the remnant of a single vessel, a single outpost, or something considerably larger?" "Based on the debris field's total extent," Perrin said, "considerably larger. I would not want to commit to a number I cannot defend. I would say, at minimum, we are looking at the remains of something that once matched the scope of what we ourselves are only now beginning to build, possibly far exceeded it." Kyle stood before the assembled council that evening, looking at survey imagery of wreckage that predated everything his people understood about the galaxy they had crossed 6 years of dark to reach, and felt something he had not felt since the earliest, most uncertain days of his own existence, the specific vertigo of encountering something that did not fit any framework he currently possessed. "We will proceed carefully," he told the council, though even as he said it, some quiet and unplaceable instinct told him that carefully might not this time be sufficient. "We will document, we will study, and we will not assume hostility where we do not yet have evidence of it. But I want every survey team operating near that debris field to understand clearly that we are no longer simply building a home in an empty system. We may be building it in someone else's territory, and I do not yet know whether whoever that someone else is remembers we are here." Frendel, who had argued against nearly every cautious position Kyle had taken across 6 hard years of shared leadership, surprised him that evening by arguing for restraint more forcefully than Kyle himself had. "I would keep every vessel we can spare well clear of that field until we understand considerably more than we do now," Frendel said, after the wider council had dispersed, the two of them alone in the chamber, in a stillness that had become, over the years, its own kind of comfortable ritual. "I have spent 6 years arguing that we should act decisively, that hesitation costs us more than boldness does. I find myself tonight arguing the opposite, and I do not entirely trust myself to say why. I only know that whatever built what Perrin's team found, it was building on a scale that should frighten us considerably more than it apparently frightens the rest of the council." "It frightens me," Kyle admitted. "I did not say so in front of the others. I saw no benefit in it. But I share the instinct, Threndel, and I have learned across everything the last 6 years have taught me to take my instincts about scale seriously." He was quiet a moment, watching the star that was, by then, unambiguously theirs, hanging steady and unbothered outside the chamber's viewport. "We will send a single small reconnaissance vessel, unarmed, minimally crewed, to observe from a distance and nothing more. I will not risk further than that until we understand what we are actually looking at, and I will not tell the wider order how frightened I am because I do not believe fear, undirected, has ever built anything worth having. I will simply ask everyone to be careful and hope carefully turns out to be enough." It would not, though neither of them could have known that yet, watching a debris field from a safe and comfortable distance, 6 years into a home they had only just finished learning how to love. He composed his message to Ava that same night, later than usual, the observation deck darker and quieter than it had been in months. "We found something today," he wrote. "I do not yet know what it means. I know only that for the first time since we left Earth, I find myself wishing you were here not for the comfort of your company, though I always wish that, but because you were always better than I am at knowing which fears deserve to be taken seriously and which ones are simply the ordinary cost of encountering something new. I will write again once we understand more. I love you, across however many years this message takes to find you. That much, at least, I remain entirely certain of." He sent it into the dark, the way he had sent sent every message before it, and stood alone at the edge of a civilization he had spent 6 hard, extraordinary years helping build, watching a star that was not yet fully theirs, and understood with a clarity that settled over him like the first cold wind of a season neither of his species had a name for yet, that the Lattice's true test had not yet begun. If you enjoyed this video, press the like button, subscribe to the channel to help it grow, and leave a comment.